everyone, and welcome to Between the Prompts, the show where we explore how AI is reshaping teaching and learning. I'm Vanessa.
And I'm Melissa, and we're both educators who are curious, sometimes skeptical, and always excited about how AI is showing up in education and beyond.
Each week, we'll dive into a topic that's on our minds and probably on yours too, whether you're a student, an educator, or just trying to make sense of all the AI buzz.
Today, we're talking about how AI is affecting teaching and what it means to be an educator.
And to be clear, we're not talking about AI replacing educators, but rather reimagining what this educational sphere looks like for educators in the age of AI.
So with that, Vanessa, how do you think the educator's role is changing? Or is it? Are we asking the right question?
Whenever this topic comes up, I like to start by looking back, by looking way back, because one of my most distinct memories is when I started my master's degree program in the 1990s, and I started doing some readings about the future of education. And those readings suggested that education was going to be revolutionized by computing technology within the next 3 to 5 years. Imagine this. The child wakes up in the morning and they go over to their school workstation and their intelligent tutor comes on and teaches all of their lessons of the day. And people were afraid of this, but it didn't happen. And then as we saw this great rise in online learning that was paralleling the development of internet technology for everybody and the World Wide Web, it almost sounds weird to say the World Wide Web now, but in those days we were like, whoa, it's the World Wide Web. Again, there was this idea, like, would college campuses go away? Would we just end up having pre-recorded classes? And people would just learn that way online. And mind you, I love me a good YouTube tutorial just as much as the next person, but it doesn't do everything. I'm not really worried that I'm going to be out of a job, but I think that I need to respond to the technology and think about how it might change my practice. At least that's my take. How about you, Melissa?
Oh, I completely agree. I think that what AI is kind of forcing all of us to do now in educator roles is to really think through our teaching practice. Because now we have these subject matter experts that are available to us through generative AI. And it's one of those places where we have to really think about what it means to be an educator right now. And I'm with you. I don't fear that this is going to take away education jobs. I think teaching is still going to be one of the most powerful professions. But as educators, we do have to think through, how do these tools change what we're doing in the classroom? How is it going to impact what we're designing in those cases where we're thinking about hybrid and online learning? Because now there's more resources that are available very easily for students. So we have to think through how to be stronger educators in ways that are going to allow us to explore these tools along with them and still be able to help them understand some levels of mastery and content.
But, even with that, okay, so I hear you tapping into how AI is giving us another content resource that can be used in an education setting. But that really pushes two thoughts to the forefront for me. The first one is kind of a so what, because we've had all sorts of content resources that have been there sitting right alongside educators for a long time, like the public library. Even before we had digitized books, you could go and you could check out a book and you could read and learn things. And there's educational television, and there's television that wasn't meant to be explicitly educational, but you still could learn from that. Information resources are all around us. They're all over the internet. What's interesting about generative AI is its ability to engage in a dialogue with a person. If the person knows and is ready to actually have a dialogue with generative AI. But then we need to think about what's happening in that dialogue. And I think people don't think about this enough. I think there's just a fear that it holds all the content, right? Because generative AI is like a student who is a voracious reader and they've just read everything that's out there. It's encyclopedic. And that's a little bit intimidating. But I also like to think about how it can get things wrong, even with as much as it knows. For example, okay, not in the AI realm. The people who show up sometimes and they pronounce really big words incorrectly.
Oh, of
And what does
course.
that mean?
Of course. Well, we always say that it means that this is someone has read this word but has never heard it spoken. And so, on our side, we always try to celebrate that someone has said the word incorrectly because that's a teachable moment. And it's also it shows what they're learning on their own and how they're exploring and that they've read this word but maybe never heard it before.
Right. So, what you're tapping into there is that like reading everything can give you a certain subset of knowledge, but it doesn't teach you everything about it. So, in this case, the real person doesn't know how to pronounce the word right. AI doesn't know how to pair up and use all of its knowledge correctly. It doesn't understand necessarily all of the semantic differences. It can make some really weird connections sometimes because at the end of the day, it is really all about the prompts and all about the patterns, right? So this is the stuff that's sitting underneath AI. It amasses a huge amount of information and it looks for patterns within that information. And then it tries to be predictive based on what it knows about patterns for what's going to come next or what should come next. And then that's all dependent on the prompt that we give it. But it can make things up. It can just be wrong. It can blend all sorts of ideas in weird ways. Sometimes I find that actually they're really wonderful ways because it makes me think of connections that I hadn't thought of before. But I also want to note that that's me making an expert judgment that it was an interesting connection that it made, and I want to take it into new directions. So to come back to this idea of content and content experts, and is AI taking that away from us? I don't think that it is. And I think that it opens up the possibility for a lot of people to become experts in somewhat incorrect content if they rely too heavily on AI. To me, it's just like this other big call for the world of, hey, we need to develop really good analysis skills. We need to develop really good critical thinking skills. And we need to continuously engage in dialogue with each other about what makes sense and doesn't make sense, what works and what doesn't work. Let's not just trust the AI.
Yeah, and I wonder if what we're touching on here is something that we've discussed a lot on the higher education side of this is the faculty and the educators being able to teach some of the critical thinking skills. And so I think that's where I start to wonder about the content is we do have access to the content, but we have to be able to engage with it. And that's, as you said, the dialogue, the conversation with generative AI is really what stands out about it. And so do you think it's the goal of educators now to also bridge that and to help their learners, help their students be able to engage in conversations about the subject areas and about the content in different ways?
Absolutely. I think, AI brings the good questions to the classroom if we're going to invite it to be in the classroom in that content realm. And that's not the only way, of course, that we can use generative AI in the classroom. So it could be entering that teaching learning space in some very different ways.
Yeah, and I have to ask, not content related here, but just in terms of the role of the teacher. You and I both know how much time we spend doing things like lesson planning and developing out our courses. And I'm curious, as far as the educator's role in it changing, do you see any of those opportunities or challenges as far as maybe freeing up educators to think more about how they're teaching and designing their courses since maybe they have an assistant now in the AI form?
I think that's a really powerful place for teachers. There's so much pressure to, continuously have new lessons, to produce handouts for students. Again, I would never fully trust the AI to do it, but it is like having a partner there by your side. I mean, I love when I have the opportunity to talk to my human colleagues and say like, hey, what are you thinking? What are you doing? What are you teaching for this? Or I mean, I had a conversation with somebody this morning about what they were teaching for about an hour, and we ended up brainstorming different ideas for their class. And that's the kind of thing that you can do with AI. I think in higher education, um, we just don't have those conversations very frequently. I feel like there are a lot of walls up around that. I think it's really hard in K-12 because teachers are spending so much time directly with their students that finding that time to engage with colleagues and have those conversations about what they might do in the classroom when you're planning for 6 hours of classroom contact every single day. So, AI becomes your little friend who can help with those things. And when it asks you things like, would you like me to turn this into a handout for your students? You can say, yeah. And and you still have to look at the handout, right? You still have to make sure that it all makes sense, that it's not redundant. I find there's a lot of redundancy, and that it doesn't add some weird stuff on there. But sometimes, like, just the fact that it puts stuff on there in a bulleted list and the bullets are all aligned in the way that you wanted, like, that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and it seems like we have this parallel that's running in classrooms right now where we as educators are working through all of this and understanding how to use the tools to the best of our advantage, and also seeing some of the challenges they present alongside our students. So as our students are still wrestling with some of these concepts as well and figuring out how to use especially generative AI in ways that are going to help them be efficient learners and help them to really move into those more critical thinking tasks along the way. Yeah, it's really interesting to see us learning as our students are learning too.
Yeah, so I think AI can really jump in and help out in some places where teachers were doing a lot of planning and fussing around content and putting content in different forms in order to be able to maybe differentiate a little bit, or make it look like a handout or whatever for their students. So that's a little bit of a shift in the role. But then there's also that shift in the role of having to contend with what content AI has brought to the table and the accuracy of it. And I love that we're talking about roles right now, because I know you and I have co-authored about like the roles of the online instructor. For our listeners, if anybody's not familiar with that, there's been a lot of conversation about different roles that online instructors play, and really it's all instructors. But when online learning really became possible, we had to think not just about the pedagogical role of teachers, but that they had this administrative or managerial role. It's not as much of the Wild West with online learning anymore, but it was for a while. A social role where you've got to bring everybody together and figure out how they're going to interact with each other. And then the technological role, how is the technology going to work? And I can really see how all four of those roles come into play when we're talking about AI. So here's our second big question for the day, and I'll put this one out to you, Melissa. What new roles do you think educators have to play when AI is brought into the classroom?
I think one of the ones that stands out to me the most is that we almost have to have our educators take on these roles of people who can help their learners navigate bias and navigate misinformation. And so I don't think this is a new role, because we've been talking about information literacy for a very long time, but this is different. And I think there is a piece of that now educators have to really step into this role of someone who is able to help students with literacy in the AI space. And I would think that that's almost all educators right now, because it doesn't seem to be discipline dependent. And that I think is a little bit different. I think before, when we were talking especially about information literacy, that often fell on language teachers, on writing teachers, communications professors, right? So it fell in these spaces where we were kind of teaching almost knowledge acquisition. How does this work? How do we sort through it? But now, as faculty and as teachers, as we're trying to get our students to use this, there is a new role that comes in that helps with understanding how we're navigating information that's being generated for us. And I think that's going to hold up across different disciplines. So I was just reading an article this week about how much AI is changing coding, and how in the computer sciences, how much this is completely removing a level of learning that students had to have before to show some sort of mastery over the content. Yet they still have to understand the code. They have to understand the output. And so I think that's a bit of a different role now for educators, is they have to also be able to navigate not only the content, not only the students, but how students are interacting with these generated responses. And I think that's going to be a key part of this. But also we've had a lot of talk around prompt engineering, which falls under this same category. I would think with, do educators really need to be teaching their students how to become better prompt engineers as well? So I think those pieces kind of come together in teaching AI as a tool and as a piece of something that's going to be important to them throughout their studies and throughout their career, which I think is another piece that is going along with how we're preparing our students.
Yeah. So just yesterday, I was actually sitting with a group of about 10 K-12 teachers, and we were talking about what's going on for them right now, the kinds of things that they want to learn how to do. There was an instructor who teaches coding as part of what he does. And he was actually saying, like, prompt engineering is where he wants to go with this, that he's maybe going to take some of the emphasis off of the coding component for the students, but how do they get to the code that they want? How do they learn to be able to describe and ask for it effectively and efficiently? So this is very much bringing in this new skill set. I want to hear, I know, like, tapping into your English and language background here. And going back to this issue of how we navigate increased use and what students are doing, some of the ethics of it, even, right? Like, is it okay to be using it? What happens as we use it a lot? So I was reading some news the other day, and I read something about how language is changing because of people's use. And so I thought, like, well, when is it okay and when is it not okay for students to use AI to assist them with writing? But even more so, as we have it assisting them with writing, the AI models, because they're built on this pattern recognition and this predictive text, that they might be encouraging certain words to be used more frequently than others. And so it's starting to shift in language. One of the words that stands out for me was delve. The word delve has apparently started to have increased use in everyday life, right along with words like delulu, right? But the origins of delulu and the origins of delve are very different places. So what do you think about that happening to our language and communication?
Yeah, I'm going to respond by first telling you my word, which is tapestry. The word tapestry has shown up so much in conversation lately and in student papers as well, because that's another one of those words that the AI is just bridging into, it seems like, every single conversation. So I think we all have those words that feel like kind of giveaways about when AI is being used. As far as the language piece, I think it's multifaceted here. So just as you reflected at the top of the show on how the threats were there about what was going to happen with online education and this idea of these forms taking on the role of educators, and that it's the same thing with language. Language has always evolved. This is nothing really new especially in the composition space. We see this often when we study linguistics and when we study language over time. There are always words that kind of come in and out, and the origins, of course, are different. But it just shows that I think a sort of a natural evolution of language and how it changes. What I do see impacting writing, though, and communications from students is I worry some, this is going to be one of the points where I reflect a little bit and be a bit skeptical, is that now student writing often appears very similar. And so the structure is the same. And this is in cases, let's say, where we've encouraged students to use AI to work through concepts and go through brainstorming and reflect on what the process was like using the tool, right? Which is becoming pretty standard now in college composition classrooms. We want to be teaching AI alongside the writing. So the difference, though, is that now everyone is starting to sound the same. sentence structures are very similar. The use of series, commas, where you list three things, and incorporating words like the howevers and all those transition words that we would always teach before now seem to just be part of the language, and the structure is very similar. So it's in that realm. Chat GPT and Copilot and all of these tools that we're using in Grammarly, which has just kind of been running in the background for so long. What we're starting to see, though, is that the student output, the student writing and submission, it's following very pattern-like writing, and I think that's a bit of a miss for us right now. Is it's too consistent among all writers, and that's a little troubling to me.
Along those lines, and I'll take it maybe a little bit outside of writing, although it still connects to writing. You mentioned, like getting a series of 3 ideas coming out of it. And I have seen so many of those patterns happening, and I've seen students experiencing that as well, where if they ask for an idea about something, or ask, what are the hallmarks of insert whatever you're inquiring about here, and they're getting back a response that will say, like, the 5 main ideas related to this are, and so then they ask the next one, the 5 main ideas related to that are. And I think it's very attractive to us as humans to be able to put a number on it, say there are 3 main ideas for this, or 5 main ideas for that. And I mean, it's kind of choosing those arbitrarily, sometimes redundantly. So if you get a long enough list of things, you start to see where it's just doubled up on the ideas. And I'll go back to that's where those critical thinking skills are needed. And then I'm going to try to pull us back to our question, because I know you and I are great at getting onto tangents about this stuff too. But like, what roles do the educators have to play now when AI is brought into the classroom? And so part of it is this ethical part. I think another day we should probably really get into things like the bias and the misinformation, but like just even responsible use, and when it's okay and when it's not okay, and what it's going to do, like flatten out your language and make you sound like everybody else. Teach it how to. Teachers need to help with figuring out how to use it well anyway, like the prompt engineering part of it. And even things like getting AI to help you improve your writing, you have to write the prompts just so in order to do that, because otherwise, I mean, goodness, every single thing I put in there, it says, "That's a fantastic idea, Vanessa. You are so insightful." I'm like, "Ooh, yes, why I am. Thank you so much." It's very flattering. So you have to be really specific about the kinds of things that you want feedback for. And if you want it to catch all of the cases and not just the top 3 cases or top 3 instances of something. So I think this bigger picture is, to the extent that a teacher wants to invite AI into their classroom or recognizes that it's there anyway. We'll be talking about that a lot when we talk about students. This role that teachers are going to have to become AI guides as well. I think that's a new role.
Yeah, it's funny though, Vanessa, as we've talked this through, I can't help but wonder now, are these new roles, or are they just adaptations of some of the existing roles, like the ones that we mentioned in the chapter that we wrote? I kind of wondered now if we're really categorizing the work that has to be done. So what those big picture roles are, I do wonder if some of those are just evolving or shifting a little, changing in some way, and maybe not necessarily anything new. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I kind of think that everything old becomes new again and so on. I don't know. We could ask AI, and it might tell us that there are 3 main new roles. I'm kind of tempted right now to go say, what new roles are you creating for teachers, and seeing what it would say. The funny thing is, if I ask that question, I'm like 99.9% sure it would give me an answer that gave me new roles, even if there really weren't new roles. I don't think it would push back and say there really aren't new roles. And that right there is an issue to be contended with in the realm of AI. So, and with that, I think I'm going to try to take us in the next direction, or should I delve into the tapestry of things that we wanted to talk about today? Dare I do that? Let's shift to our third big question, which is, It's not just what's changing for teachers and their perceptions of their job, but what's changing in the classroom.
I think probably the one that I've seen the most is how educators are starting to really move into a space of adaptive learning. I think that's been a big conversation right now because we do have these tools that can engage students in a dialogue. There's been a lot more talk about adaptive learning across various disciplines. So that was something in education that we talk about all the time. But in other fields now, I'm starting to see more and more happen around this idea that can we personalize learning? Can we provide a tool or a space for students to engage in more personalized learning? And again, if we set aside the questions around some of the information, because if let's say we built out the GPT, so it's in a contained and controlled environment, I think educators are really starting to think through if the right information is there and can be used to prompt students with other questions to respond to them, how can this change and make more personalized learning a situation where we're dealing with a lot of students that may not be able to get that feedback in the same way?
It's really fun for me to see this whole focus coming up right now on personalized learning because we're treating it like, woo, it's new and AI has brought it to us. But actually, if you go into the history of education, the use of that term goes back a ways. I want to say that it's like 1960s, and people were talking about individualized instruction a lot. If you went to elementary school in the early mid 1970s, you might have started to see some of the manifestation of that in the classroom. I remember the little boxes with cards that we would pull out, and everybody could be at a slightly different level and could be doing different things. And that was considered normal. We've had, a move back toward everybody whole class instruction and trying to really push people forward. Reading has always put the pushback on that in a big way, especially at the lower grades, because just developmentally, even though the kids are going to get there, they're not all there at the exact same developmental stage with their reading skills when you're in K, when you're in 1, when you're in 2. And you have like the whole leveled reading programs. But yeah, the personalization is important. If you think about, the students who are second language learners who show up in the classroom, and the language part is really hard for them, but you could use a large language model to knock down the reading to a lower reading level, simplify some of the words, or even if you found a source that gave a really good explanation that you wanted to use, you can ask it to write it for a lower level. I do that all the time with some of my work because I recognize as somebody who writes scholarly papers, I might have a tendency to use some long sentences, some large words, complex sentence constructions, and then I can ask for some assistance when I'm writing to a more generalized audience to knock something down to, say, the 10th grade level or the 12th grade level. The power for a teacher to be able to do that and help a struggling student. Or actually, if you think about personalization in another direction, I talked to a teacher recently who said that they had a group of students who had a really specific interest that motivated them beyond everything else. And I was thinking, oh, so you may not know a lot about that particular topic. So like for me, imagine my students all came in and said that they were really interested in football. And honestly, I just don't know enough about football. I hope that's not too un-American of me. I mean, I'll go to a game and I'll sit there and watch it and get a big pretzel and enjoy the moment with everybody else. But it's just not really my thing. But I could use AI to help me come up with like football themed materials and examples for those students really quickly. And that might be something that connects to them and motivates them for learning about whatever it is that we're supposed to be learning about without requiring any extra effort of me.
Are you seeing the same trends with maybe with assessments? How are you seeing teachers and educators? Are they using AI for creating different assessments or differentiating any sort of measurement tools as well?
I haven't really been seeing that much with assessments beyond rubrics because writing a good rubric is really difficult. And I think that that's an area where a large language model can be helpful, because finding those patterns of, your idea and then what connects to it, or making suggestions to you based on your assignment of what you might be looking for. Or if you feed it the standard, it can help you start to determine if you are in alignment. So it's like it's giving you that evaluative check, and then it can actually suggest some of the specifications or parameters that you're looking for when you're assessing. But since you mentioned assessment, I wanted to share, I found this really interesting. About a year ago, when I was keynoting a conference in Indonesia, everybody was talking about AI. And I was so used to the AI conversation that we were having here in the United States. And it was about the students. It was about the students cheating and having AI write their papers. And when I got to the conference and I was listening to the AI sessions over there, they were talking about the teachers and the teachers using AI. And I had a conversation with somebody about this, and I said, "You're not really talking about the students using it." And there were some concerns there about just like even how much technology access students had, and wondering about that and their abilities to use it. But that the teachers, the educators, had really large classes, and so their grading load was huge. The whole conversation was about teachers using AI to assess students. And I hadn't been thinking about it in those terms at all. I still feel very committed to it is my job to assess my students and to give them, if not personalized instruction, personalized feedback. But I mean, I recognize that that's changing, and we've had adaptive testing for a while, and we've had the ability to do automated assessments. It's just not like really out into that generative AI realm. So that's the new thing that we're getting here. And those are more conversations to be had.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it really does touch back to what's changing in the classrooms, because if you're following in the ed tech world, I mean, that's a big part of some of the learning management systems purpose and goals in the upcoming years is to really build these feedback tools in so that they are generative and that it's personalized feedback for student submissions. And we know it's happening. We know that there are faculty who are uploading student assignments and getting feedback on them and then using that as a conversation. But it's interesting that this is a place where the technology might be driving some of the changes and some of the possibilities of how policies are going to be enacted, because we've been so focused on institutional policy and student policy that we really haven't talked about expectations for educators and their use. And when that kind of goes up against the competition of the LMS and of all of these different tools, leaving feedback on student work, I think that's something we're going to have to address as well.
Oh, Melissa, we could do an entire podcast really on the process and the ethics of educators uploading student papers and using that for to provide feedback to students, whether that process is visible to the students or is not visible to the students. But what's scary to think about, and I think where we really don't want to get is to the point where AI is running everything, which means that if students are generating papers with AI and then instructors are assessing papers with AI, all the humans are doing is putting in a prompt, generating a document, and passing it off to another human being who puts in a prompt, uploads a document, and generates another new document on top of that. Now, I don't think that's where we want to be, but that will lead us to our fourth and final big question, which is, what are the big questions for the education profession right now? I'm certainly thinking about the potential for that loop a lot as a big question and whether or not we want to get there. The other big question that I think about a lot is teacher preparation programs. Part of that is my own responsibility for helping to set the curriculum for a technology course for teacher education. I'm really thinking about what do pre-service teachers need to learn about using AI. and also knowing that whatever they're taught is already going to be outdated by the time they actually get to their real classrooms. So what is it that we're teaching that is really the mindset more than the tool set? I think that's a really important thing, because all sorts of more advanced things that we can't even think of right now will be possible by the time they get into classrooms. So for me, how does teacher preparation evolve is a big question for the profession. How about you?
Yeah, I think that especially in the higher ed spaces, in faculty development and in faculty support, it's the same thing. All roads right now are leading to AI, regardless of what the big topics are. And so I think one of the questions of our profession is anybody who's working in instructional design, who's working in teaching and learning, faculty development, it's how are we going to continue with our mission to support learning and support growth and development when we're also having to temper that with conversations around AI, because that's what everyone wants to talk about, and it's being incorporated into everything from looking at assessment to teacher presence to online learning and development. So there are all of these places where AI is really dominating the conversation right now, and I think one of the big questions we have is how much do those roles have to change to support teachers and support educators in order to make sure that we're still mission driven in the work that's being done. And I think probably the other big questions for the profession is thinking through what's next, right? This has ushered in conversations that are changing the way we think about some skill sets. And so what is that going to do in terms of interdisciplinary growth? Because I see that as an area right now where we could see some developments and some changes in the upcoming years because of the way AI is being used. I think we could probably start shifting to some more interdisciplinary approaches. So in higher ed spaces, it's figuring out where are we going to set the baseline, right? What are going to be those baseline skills that we expect students to have at 1, 2, and 3 levels? And then how is AI going to change that and change the work that we're doing in terms of assessments, in terms of planning out curriculum? You think just from writing spaces, how this has shifted what's happening in terms of the overall programmatic goals of writing programs. And that's just one example. So I think it's the big picture comes to how are we going to continue to prepare for those of us who are in support roles? How are we going to continue to support our educators? And then what is this going to do to the curriculum and how we're defining different levels of mastery and defining baseline skills? So I think it's a staggered look at what's going to be impacting the work that's happening in the classrooms.
I think I might toss in one more big question. I'm not sure how to formulate it just yet, but something like how is AI going to push us to highlight and embrace and truly capitalize on the human parts of the profession, to really prize those parts that are uniquely human and that I think are going to remain uniquely human, because there's still a difference in how a human thinks and how AI performs. And I really want to make that distinction too between thinking and performing.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that humans can do that AI cannot do, even if AI continuously gets us excited because it tells us all of our ideas are absolutely fabulous, and it can change its tone and try to sound caring about things. And we got to teach people to be a little bit more skeptical about that stuff. Oh, goodness. There's a lot of work to be done here. So it's an exciting time. It's a little bit of an, scary time too. And maybe it's good for us to be scared and attentive to that so that we will think critically about it and not just think about how students need to be thinking critically when they use AI.
Yeah, absolutely, because it is impacting nearly every aspect of our very complex system and education that we're all a part of. So with that, do you have any final thoughts about AI in the classroom?
No, but I'm looking forward to us talking about it from the student perspective next, because there's so much to say about what students are doing and also how educators think about that.
Great. I look forward to it. Thank you, Vanessa.
All right. Well, we'd love for you to stay connected. So subscribe to the podcast, share it with a colleague or friend, and feel free to send us your questions or topic ideas. And join us next time when we will talk about how students are using AI.